Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to start by just introducing myself and see the comments before we get to the presenters and the presentations and the topic for today. So my name is Naseem Nobari. I'm the director of Seed the Commons. We're a small grassroots organization that's based in San Francisco. On World Food Day of 2020, so October 16th, we started a webinar series called Rethinking Food and Agriculture in a Time of COVID and Climate Change. We launched it not only to coincide with World Food Day, but also to coincide with the publishing of a new book called Rethinking Food and Agriculture, New Ways Forward. So we're really thinking about all the different parts of our food systems, even though we've been focusing also a lot on the farming part, and why this is such an important area of focus at a time where we're facing environmental crises, public health crises, inequality, et cetera. And so this is something that Seed the Commons has been doing for a long time. We really encourage people to get involved in transitioning our food system away from something that is based on profit towards something that is ecologically sound, socially sound, and so on. And we do a lot of this through public education. So just like these webinars in the past, we used to do a lot of events, a lot of political education, workshops, et cetera, to empower people to, in some cases, grow their own food, but also in many ways become activists, become better activists, and so on. All right, so today, and just a few housekeeping notes. So if you're on Zoom, there's the chat function and the Q&A function. Try to keep those separate if you can. It's easier for us to manage. So if you have questions for the speakers, put it in the Q&A segment, and I'm going to be relaying questions to the speakers after their presentations. If you would like to just comment and share thoughts and chat amongst each other, then use the chat function for that. And if you would like to support this webinar series, we're offering it free, but we don't have much funding and anything is helpful. There is a link on the Facebook event page and also on the Zoom link to our cause box. And so you can make a donation there. All right, so we're going to get started. So I'm really happy to have both Iain Tolhurst and Liz Ross here today. The past couple webinars that we did were focused more specifically on environmental issues. And that is, we're going to continue speaking about that. That is very important. But I also wanted to start bringing in more of a social justice perspective, of a political perspective, and speak about why our food systems are very central to that, and why transitioning away from industrial farming is not something that should only interest environmentalists. It's already a great step forward to get environmentalists to speak about food systems, but now we also need to speak about these things in terms of, for example, with this pandemic, we've seen rising inequality. So all of this relates to what we're farming, how we're treating the earth, and so on. And so I'm really happy that Liz Ross is here today because she's going to address some of those issues. All right, so the title of Liz's talk is Agroecology, the Basis of a Socially Just Food System. And Liz Ross is the founding director of Rethink Your Food, a nonprofit that promotes a food system that does not depend on industrial animal agriculture. Liz co-founded Vegan Advocacy Initiative in 2015. Through VAI, Liz co-created and co-organized the first of its kind people of color animal rights advocacy and food justice conferences. These events provided a platform for vegans of color to share their work as advocates for animal liberation, the environment, and food justice. Liz has been involved in volunteer work for over a decade in criminal justice reform, animal rights activism, and food justice. Liz studied ecological horticulture and food justice on a 30-acre farm at the UC Santa Cruz Center for Agroecology and Sustainable Food Systems program. She studied permaculture at Occidental Arts and Ecology Center. Her family owns 300 acres of agricultural land in a rainforest in the Caribbean, growing mainly cacao, fruits, and bamboo. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll let you go ahead.
Thank you for having me, Naseem. So for the next 15 to 20 minutes, I'm going to touch on a big topic basically two competing paradigms of food production in the world today. So here are three photos that are expressions of one social movement. To the top right, or top left, the Vidarbha region of Northeast India was once known for its cotton production. It's now mostly known as the suicide belt of India. Almost 60,000 smallholder farmers have committed suicide in India since the 1980s, either by drinking pesticide or hanging themselves. Many of them left widows and children to cope with the financial debt. Hold on one second here. So here you have farmers protesting, and I'll get more into that. In the middle part, we have farmers in Manila in the Philippines. In 2014, farmers in Manila in the Philippines protested at the entrance of the Department of Agriculture with an art display of the majestic rice terraces located in northern region of the Philippines. The reason for this artwork is significant because the rice terraces have been cultivated for over 1,000 years using indigenous farming methods and without forced labor and colonial help. So one of the actual protesters, John Sarmiento, a farmer and organizer in Manila, plants a variety of fruits and vegetables along with his main crop, rice. He feels that the government's approval of genetically modified golden rice, which is fortified with beta-carotene, could ruin his livelihood. Basically, our bodies convert beta-carotene to vitamin A. Sarmiento feels that this GM rice will not address the lack of vitamin A. That issue can be addressed by, of course, educating people to eat fruits and vegetables rich in vitamin A, common sense. What GM rice would do, he said, is worsen hunger, kill species diversification, and contaminate other crops. Number three, to the bottom right, we have in 2010, about 10,000 farmers in Haiti marched to protest the government for accepting seeds as a gift to Monsanto, from Monsanto, which is now known as Bayer. The protest, which included burning the seeds, was organized by several Haitian rural social movements working towards food and seed sovereignty as an alternative to industrial agriculture. Smallholder farmers are suffering around the world, especially in the global south. They are the ones to experience firsthand the effects of the green revolution. Most people associate the word green with environmentally friendly products and projects. The term green revolution, in this case, has nothing to do with that. It took flight around the 1960s, and it is a model of farming that relies on fossil fuel-based commercial inputs and technologies of crop breeding. So it is science and technology used in a specific way together with a specific kind of economic system. And it was and still is marketed as the best way to increase food production and end world hunger. The stories that connect these farmers go something like this. You operate a small farm of about 4 acres, which is about 2 hectares. You grow a variety of crops, including, for example, corn or maize, your biggest cash crop. You make a fairly decent living, which means that you're not going hungry. You always have enough to eat. You let some of your plants grow to seed so that you can have enough to plant for the next harvest. You exchange seeds with local farmers, and sometimes you will buy local seeds from the store. While talking to another farmer, you found out that the local seed company has a new kind of seed called BT corn, and they claim that it will double your yields and double your income. The news is all over town, so you talk to one of the seed company representatives, and he tells you that the entire package comes with this superhero seed and is disease and pest resistant, and that you have to buy along with it in the package chemical fertilizers and pesticide. Now, since everyone's talking about getting rich over this, you figure that it was, worth your investment and trying out. Little did you know that is the seed was owned and licensed by a multinational corporation who has been working with your government to implement laws that criminalize unauthorized growing of this seed if you don't pay royalties to the seed company. You can't afford to buy the package deal, but no problem. You heard the lenders are on board, so you take out a loan. About 2 months later, your corn is growing, but they don't look too good. You go back to the store and they say, oh, that's because you're not using enough water. You have to water it frequently. So they tell you to buy this irrigation system and add more pesticide. So you do, and your costs, of course, go up. Tons of water later, you get a good yield, but you can't make a profit yet because you're still paying off your debt. Your second crop becomes infested with worms, and you're now told that the BT corn is resistant only to one insect, the corn borer. So to get rid of the worms, you will have to double up on a specific kind of pesticide, another pesticide, which means spending more money. Then a drought comes along, and guess what? You lose everything. With your traditional seeds, you have always been able to survive droughts, even when you lose a bit of your harvest, because those seeds grew well in the weather conditions in your local area, including the rainy and drier patterns throughout the year. But this time, your entire new single variety monoculture crop of corn that you invested in is wiped out. For those who don't know, monoculture means that it's just rows and rows of the same kind of crop, of seed. So what are you going to do now, since your investment has now wiped out? You have a family to feed, you have no income coming in, and you're in more debt than you ever dreamed of. Today, a handful of multinational corporations have bought up most of the seed companies creating a monopoly over the shrinking varieties that are available on the market. They also supply the chemical inputs, and because of seed patents, farmers get trapped into the dependency cycle of having to purchase new seed for every new crop, along with a steady supply of chemical inputs. By the way, can everybody hear me? I didn't ask. Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay,
no problem.
Good. Thank you. I didn't check that in the beginning. So because farmers don't have the power to dictate the price of inputs and wholesale food prices, when input costs go up and when surplus food is imported into their country and sold cheaply, it is difficult for them to sell their harvest at a price that will make them a decent profit. So they don't earn enough money to last for the 6 months or so period until the next harvest. And by month 4, they go hungry. For many rural people, their land is an important part of their identity, source of well-being, their cultural connection, and security for the next generation. But this model of food production has accelerated the migration of people off their land to cities. And wealthy landowners have seized this opportunity to buy more land and consolidate to an even bigger operation. So there are 2 points that I want to note here. First, Big Ag claims that people go hungry because we have a scarcity of food. So they argue that they then need to expand their business and buy more land to grow more food. But according to a report in the Journal of Sustainable Agriculture, as well as other reports, for over 2 decades, the rate of global food production has increased faster than the rate of the global population growth. According to the FAO, the world produces more than 1.5 times enough food to feed the population projected for 2015. Plus, about 30% of the food in the global north is wasted. So I would say it's more likely that there's a financial incentive for this scarcity narrative because we clearly have enough food. And I also want to add that about 70% of our food is produced on smallholder family farms. They are also primarily Black and brown people, most of whom are women. So perhaps a better solution is to provide an environment for farmers to thrive, right? The second issue is that even though we have enough food to go around today, more than 800 million people go hungry, and 80% of the people who are food insecure live in rural areas, many of whom are farmers and farm workers. So basically, the people who grow our food are poorer and food insecure. The high cost of inputs, low wholesale prices, and policies and laws that are not in favor of small farmers do not allow for most of them to work their way out of poverty. In addition, farm workers are exploited as cheap commodities, and the system makes it difficult for them to work their way out of poverty. Many food movements experts will argue that poor people go hungry because they cannot afford to buy food. Lack of access is the problem, not scarcity, which is the pitch of people who are invested in the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution, though through industrial agricultural practices and neoliberal policies, have been successful at making large companies richer and in control of our food supply, albeit less nutritious food. It has been successful at taking away food sovereignty and driving small farmers either into debt, poverty, or out of business, particularly in the global South, but not restricted to the global South. It has caused soil erosion. That doesn't drain well, loss of microbial life, deforestation, greenhouse gas emissions. It has created a massively high level of animal exploitation in concentrated animal feeding operations beyond anything we've seen. Plus, farmers and farm workers are being exploited to toxic chemicals. So obviously, we need to create a more just food system. For starters, we must address the concentration of power in the hands of a small group of multinational companies who have forced a set of farming and economic practices upon farmers that are supported by governments, academic agricultural institutions, and by philanthropists who create and fund projects like, currently we have AGRA, which is the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. So there are organizations that are attempting to do just that. And La Via Campesina is one of them. La Via Campesina is the largest transnational social movement, a global alliance of smallholder farms, also proudly known as peasant farmers. They also include landless farmers, farm workers, and indigenous people. They are a collective of about 300 million people. They collaborate to advance policy and practices, local and international, toward food sovereignty. They are a multicultural movement, political in its demand for social justice, while being independent from any political party, economic, or other type of affiliation. So here are some of the things that's important to note, as you see on the screen. Defend food sovereignty and the struggle for land and agrarian reforms, promote agroecology and defend local seeds, promote peasant rights and struggle against criminalization of peasants, which has been going on in many places, in which they're jailed or killed. Defend peasant agriculture for food sovereignty as a way to promote social justice and dignity. Strongly oppose corporate-driven agriculture that destroys social relations and nature, and defend women's rights and gender equality and struggles against all forms of violence against women. Women take up 80% of the small farmers, and they're also subject to a lot of violence. Now, I mentioned agroecology. This slide shows some of the main differences between the two models of food production. So on the left, you have industrial agriculture, which basically promotes largely monocultures, use chemical inputs and commercial organic inputs. You may have transgenic seeds, or you may have hybrid seeds, which is actually not transgenic, but these seeds are owned and patented by large corporations who have bought up a lot of the seed companies. And they also have managed to sneak in patents through influencing political governments. And then, of course, you have CAFOs, which are the factory farms and deforestation. And then you have large corporations which control all aspects of the food production. And as a result, of course, you have this dependency where small farmers and farmers in general have to depend on them for inputs, loans, pricing, and so on. And then you have corporations and foundations basically feeling that, or the leaders of those corporations and foundations basically feeling that they actually know how to feed the world and they have the solutions, which is obviously a bit arrogant, to say the least. Seed patents, as I mentioned, and criminalizing seed sovereignty. They're also pro mega farms, because the larger the farm, the cheaper the food. You can't have a mega farm without having a monoculture. Even the so-called organic food is monoculture, and the organic inputs are commercially bought inputs. So they're also pro-monopoly and, of course, pro-oligarchy, meaning that they're the ones who determine the fate of the food system. They lobby and change policy, and they set up, as we know, international trade agreements. And part of that big business is influencing governments to sell them land through land grabbing. On the other side, you have agroecology. Now, what I want you to take away from is that I'm not going into the specifics of agroecological farming per se. For this talk, what is important is that agroecology does not just focus on ecological farming principles, like, as I show in the first part, genetic diversity, closed loop systems, cover cropping, species diversity, and so on. As we all know, that's also in organic and regenerative farming. For this talk, what's important is that agroecology is pro-small farmer, pro-farmer to farmer collaboration, and pro-community, all within a socioeconomic and cultural and environmental context, as is mentioned in the list here, which includes seed sovereignty and basically focusing on what is best for farmers to make a decent living and support their community with good, healthy food. It's also important to note that both models have a political component, which I can get into more later in the Q&A. But it's also explained here. Proponents of the Green Revolution would like to have you believe that agroecology is just another farming method like organic or regenerative farming, but it is not true. Agroecology specifically is an alternative to the green revolution. And here we have, I just wanted to leave you with some books and organization resources. And you can also contact me through the email here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liz. That was great, very informative, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions afterwards. All right, so as I said to people who joined later, we're going to do the Q&A after both presentations. So if you have questions for Liz, you can put them in the Q&A segment, but we'll get to them later. All right, so I thought that presentation was really excellent, and I'm so happy that you could be with us, because that's really what I wanted people to get from this, that these are not, I didn't want it to seem that we're just talking about how to grow food sustainably. While very important, like there's so many other components to this issue. And when See the Comments actually started, it was really because like we didn't personally have experience. Well, we had a little bit of experience with farming, but really not a lot. And that wasn't the interest. The interest was that, we were coming from like an anti-war and anti-globalization background, seeing the human rights violations that went along with corporate globalization. And so the idea was that it's through land, it's through agroecology that you're reclaiming resources, the resources that these guys are basically taking away through land grabbing and forcing farmers into industrial farming and so on. And so we're taking that back. We're taking it back to the base. And instead of putting our money and our taxes and all of these things into a system that is causing environmental degradation and human rights abuses and all of these things, we're growing something else. And so in terms of growing something else, I think that one of the things that I really liked looking at Iain's websites and the things that he's written is that it's not only that we can think in terms of what is a more sustainable, humane, socially just way to do agriculture. We can actually think about agriculture as something that is an active good in the world. And it's not only a question of being less degrading and destructive of our environments, but also restoring environments, building better relationships and so on. And one of the things I read from Iain was that he thinks in terms of growing biodiversity, and food is just a byproduct of that. And as Jennifer Molidor in our last webinar had mentioned, when we think about environmental issues, we speak often about climate change, but not so much about the collapse of biodiversity. So yeah, I'm just hoping that we're getting much more of a holistic vision today and really seeing the potential of transitioning away from industrial farming towards stock-free, organic, agroecological growing methods. All right, so I'll read you Iain's bio, and then we can get going. The title of his talk is Growing Green, Stock-Free Organic Agriculture, a Future Farming System for a Planet with Compassion. Iain Tolhurst has been at the forefront of the UK organic farming movement for over 40 years. His 8-hectare farm has won many awards, the most recent being Soil Farmer of the Year. His most recent book, Back to the Land, a chronological compilation of many articles and papers that he has written during his long career, gives a fascinating account of the way his farm and business has developed, with much emphasis on soil management. His earlier work, co-written with Jenny Hall, has become a textbook for many, especially the newly emerging young people keen to get into stock-free organic food production. For many decades, he has been delivering inspirational speeches and presentations on the farm's organic and sustainable methods or food production. His wide knowledge and experience has made him in much demand both nationally and increasingly internationally, delivering presentations and educational seminars. The farm is a model of sustainability and produces a wide range of produce for the local community. Visitors from all over the world are able to see for themselves the various components of the stock-free organic farm, from green manures and diverse rotations to the wood chip composts and integration of agroforestry, to the vegetable system. Iain has been able to maintain a viable and sustainable business on land which was not considered suitable for vegetable production. The integration of crops, a systems approach to pest and disease management, and biodiversity makes for a fascinating and durable agricultural system. He has been heard to say the primary product of this farm is the culture of biodiversity. Food production is the byproduct of that. All right, thank you so much for being here, Iain.
Thank you, Nassim. Can you see and hear my PowerPoint okay?
Yes.
Right, okay, so I'm going to take you through really very quickly, I hope, our farm, which has been established since 1976. We're stock-free, so we are veganic. We are certified by both the Soil Association and the Vegan Organic Network. This is a relatively new set of standards which justify, or rather quantify, what stock-free veganic production really is. We're producing over 100 different crops, and our average yields on this have been going up and up, particularly in the last few years. We're now around 120, 140 tons a year. It's almost, not complete, but almost a self-sufficient system in that we really import almost nothing to the farm. We're running on a very low carbon footprint. We do fairly regular carbon footprint analysis. The whole productivity of the farm really is sold within a very close radius to the farm. In fact, we've now got pretty much 90% of our sales are being dealt with within a 10-mile radius of the farm. In fact, most of it's even closer than that. So we're quite dependent on our customers who live locally, and this is really part of our philosophy. In order to make the farm commercially viable, we have to deal direct to consumer. We also act as a point of advisory. We do seminars, not so many recently because of COVID. Farm walks, still doing a few because despite the restrictions, we are allowed to do farm walks because they're educational. We have food fairs, although this year we haven't had any. And we have quite a range of different trials looking at specific technical aspects of what we do on the farm. And these trials have been run by the Organic Research Centre. Right, just a few points about our soil and climate. We're in the very south of UK. We're about 40 miles west of London and about 20 miles south of Oxford. We're we are quite a long way from the sea by UK standards. We're 40 miles from the sea. So our climate tends to be not as warm as it would be further south. We have an average rainfall of around 550 millimeters, that's about 22 inches. It's fairly dry, we're not particularly wet. We get around 65 days rainfall a year. Most people seem to think that England, it rains every day. This is not quite true, actually. We don't get anything like as much rain as some people think. The land is pretty poor. It's a grade 3C land. It's a sandy clay loam. It's very stony. In fact, 40% of our land is stone, over 10 millimeters. And it's not really considered suitable for vegetable production. Our neighbours are really just grass and trees, and there's no arable or horticultural production anywhere in the area. Our marketing is mostly through the farm shop and the bot scheme. We don't have any other outlets, and as I said earlier, this is really quite important in terms of keeping the financial viability of the farm. We have no external support. The farm has to live by what it produces. We're not subject to any grant schemes or support from any exterior source at all. The bot scheme used to be our most regular and indeed our most popular form of sales. We've now got the farm shop on the farm, and this is gradually taking over, particularly since COVID. Our farm shop has been very heavily subscribed to in the last 6 months. Local people suddenly have cottoned on to local food, which is great. We do a bit of preserves as well. This is a product which is coming all from our own produce. It's 100% our own produce, mostly tomato based from what used to be excess crop from tunnel production. This year, because of the increase in demand, which has been really quite significant, we haven't actually had to do very much preserves this year. This is our relatively new veg shed. We only built this 2 years ago. It replaced a rather temporary building before. And we pride ourselves in that for most of the year, all the vegetables we sell here are our own. We don't buy anything in at all, apart from when we get to the hungry gap, which is sort of April, May and part of June. We may supplement our own, but in most cases, it's 100% our own produce. Here we got pumpkins. This was taken this year. We harvested over 1,000 pumpkins. It's rather ironic, but the crop which is least eaten is the one which is the most easy to sell. We can sell double this amount. In fact, this year we could have sold far, far more. Yeah, the shed, by the way, this is it's off grid. It's low carbon. All timber was harvested locally. I built it myself. Whatever timber wasn't harvested on site came from recycled sources. So very much the farm, the ethics of the farm is very much based towards being self-sufficient and low carbon. This is looking down onto our two fields. This is from the hill. We're at the bottom of the Chiltern Hills. And you can see the first field is the one we've planted into agroforestry. So we have quite a bit of our land, almost more than a third of our land now has been planted up into agroforestry. We're very lucky to have a very nice environment around us. We're surrounded by trees, green fields, and you can't quite see it, but just beyond the sort of group of trees behind our field is the River Thames, which is making its way to London. We have a huge range of different crops in the field. Top left, we've got potatoes, which this year we've had, I think this year we've had the best yields of just about everything. Potatoes this year, I must apologise for bragging, but we got over 22 tonnes an acre from our potatoes this year, and 90% of that was saleable. So this is a year which conventional farmers would be quite proud of. So we're able to get very good yields. Cabbages and brassica family, we grow a huge range of different brassicas. In fact, in a 2-acre block this year, we have over 40 different types of brassica. Onions, squash, leeks. I mean, these are what we call staple crops. They occupy the bulk of our land. Here we've got potatoes going into store, onions in store. We don't have any very high-tech store. Most of our systems are relatively low-tech. I think we could say they're sort of intermediate technology rather than high technology. We don't even have a cold store. Because we sell direct, we don't need to store. We harvest and sell on the same day. This is one of our fields within the agroforestry. The whole farm is split up into rotational blocks. We have a 7-year rotation, and within that 7 years, we have 5 years of cropping, and we have 2 years of green manure. And this is where this year we were growing squash, and within the squash, we undersow the green manure during the summer, and this is what you're looking at now. So we're harvesting the squash, and the green manure is coming up underneath the squash, and that will stay in place for a further 2 years. And I call this relay green manure, where we can actually relay a green manure into the ground. Everything we do is really about creating biodiversity, not just in the soil, but above the soil and in the surrounding area. We've also got a walled garden. This is a very ancient site. It's been farmed for more than 2,000 years. It's surrounded by a wall which was built just after the Civil War. Yes, we had one of those in 1690, I think. It's been very intensively farmed since that time. I took it over in a very derelict condition. We've had to remove most of the previous person's greenhouses because they were all derelict. In the garden, we grow a much smaller quantity of crop. It tends to be higher value. We have strawberries there at the moment. This year we picked over 2,000 kilograms of strawberries from the garden. Most of the cropping tends to be quite early and quite late. Most of it is done not completely, but very nearly by hand. We only have limited range of equipment that can be used on this sort of scale. So it's very labor intensive. In fact, although it only occupies around 10% of our land area, it takes about 70% of the labor goes into the walled garden. Tunnels and greenhouses are used all year round. We never stop. The problem we have in the UK in the winter is not so much the temperature, it's the lack of daylight. I mean, today, for example, it didn't get properly light until 9 o'clock this morning, and it got dark again at 3 o'clock. So, we suffer from very low light levels, which does really reduce how much we can grow during the winter. But we do fill them up. We keep them going right the way through the whole year. They're particularly useful in terms of extending the season. It means we can get really early crops and also very late crops. So we value the tunnels very much. We have food fairs. This is something we haven't done this year, and it's been a big loss, actually. We've really missed having people here because the farm is very much about bringing local people to the farm. We are a community interest company, and we really want to bring people onto the farm to educate them about food, about how we grow food, and about how we can farm in a way which is not only good for the environment, but also reduces the need for any animal inputs at all. There are no animal inputs to this farm. There haven't been ever. Trials and surveys, we've got a whole range of different trials going on, and we've been looking particularly in the last few years at the use of ramie or chipped wood. And this is something which hasn't really been done in the UK. There's been a little bit of work done in France, a little bit in Canada, but really nothing in the UK. So we've come up with some really interesting trials data in the last 4 years. We're looking at green manures and earthworm populations, propagation media trials, alternative cropping, and the agroforestry. Agroforestry has been very heavily monitored, so we have a very clear picture of what's been going on there since we established this agroforestry some 6 years ago, and it's yielding some very useful data. The farm is really dependent on what I refer to as a systems approach, and this is really looking at the farm as a complete organism. Although the farm is made up of lots of various independent components, and this is something which researchers really like, to put things in boxes, but we try to look at these components as a part of the whole and really try to consider the whole farm as a complete system. This is something which may not always be terribly easy for some people to grasp, but what it means is really we're working very much closely with nature, and we're looking at the whole range of pest, disease, fertility as a point of being integral to the farm rather than negative to the farm. We have very, very few problems in terms of pest and disease. We've managed to overcome virtually all of our pest disease problems, primarily through the adoption of a systems approach. So biodiversity is really important, as I think I was already quoted. You know, we look at the farm in terms of biodiversity as being the main production of the farm, and the vegetables are really a byproduct of that, rather than the other way around. Rather than trying to tack on bits of biodiversity in odd corners of the field to try and make it look as if we're doing something environment, we actually bring it into the whole cropping of the farm. It becomes integral to the whole cropping. And there's a huge range of different types of biodiversity on the farm, but I try to split that up, as researchers like to, into components. And we're looking at the soil, the understory, and the heavy carbon. So for us, the soil is the most ultimate of all biodiversity. Really happens in the soil. We know very little about it, so we're using a lot of compost. I'll tell you more about it later. We have a very diverse rotation. In the field, it's 7 years. In the garden, it's 9 years. We're down to very minimal tillage. We still do some tillage, but it's very minimal. And what we're really trying to achieve is really to retain as much possible carbon and increase the carbon, and to ensure that the earthworm thrives. And we've seen a huge change in earthworm populations since we started many years ago. And we're now up to a point where we're quite confidently can say we have in the region of around 10 million earthworms per hectare. This is over 4 million per acre. It's a very, very large number. So the earthworm really, for us, is a really good indicator of soil health. Green manures are one of the ways we feed the soil, and we've done this primarily because we don't bring very much into the farm. So we've had to develop green manure systems. It's a great way of building fertility. It's a great way of adding biodiversity, really good at recycling nutrients and recycling losses. And we're cropping just around 70% of the total farm is in crops. So that means we have 30% which is always in a green manure, which is a long-term green manure, but we also have other green manures at other points in the rotation. So we're actually covering soil pretty much nearly the whole year round. We only leave soil uncovered for relatively short periods of time in order to get a crop established. We may control weeds for a month or two, but eventually we'll allow either green manure to come in, we'll sow a green manure, or we even allow sometimes weed cover to take over. We're not adverse to weed cover in the right place. Fertility building crops are really based around such things as lucerne and clovers, leguminous crops, but also we use non-leguminous crops as well. And we have a whole range. We're now producing green manures with up to 15 or 20 species in a mix. And the greater the diversity of these, the greater the soil biology will become. I've got a great passion for diversity, and that also means diversity in plants in terms of crops, but also in terms of green manures. The more diversity we have in green manures and plants, the greater diversity of biological functions in the soil. So we increase in the fungi and bacteria simply by having a large range of plants. We're also doing this process what I call green manure and relay green manure, which is in introducing green manure crops into grown crops. You'll see the tomatoes there in the tunnel. I have a leguminous crop growing underneath. This would be trefoil and white clover and one or two other things. It's a really good way of improving the soil fauna and fertility. It helps to keep the pest predator balance healthy, and it's particularly good outdoors where we're protecting the soil from winter weather, and helps to stabilize soil. This is what one of our green manures would look like in the spring. This picture would be taken sometime in May, and this would be the green manure that was sown in the previous squash crop, and it's allowed to flower in the spring. We actually allow it to set seed, and it doesn't get mown until the seed has set, and then we'll continue to mow that crop 2 or 3 times a year for the following 2 years, and then it goes back into cropping. In the gardens, we're using green manures in a strip mechanism where we're growing crops between areas of green manure. You can see we've got courgettes here just coming up, and the green manure in that situation would be a mixture of legumes and some wildflowers. And then in the field, we're on a much larger scale, and each of these blocks is around 2 acres. We're sowing into this crop, which I've already told you about, which is squash. It's our last crop in our rotation, our 7-year rotation. And this green manure will then be in that position for the following 2 years, building fertility, improving the earthworm populations. And then beetle banks, we have across the field, we have lots of these beetle banks. They're a mixture of wildflowers and grasses. They've been sown, they gradually change and become quite different over a period of time, but they're there really to connect all the hedges up. So we've got hedges all the way around the fields. It helps to connect the hedges up, allows for biological diversity to move in and out of the field. It's a bank, literally a bank. This is my hedge fund. This is where we keep all our insects, predatory insects. This is where we create habitats for them to live. So rather than sticking them somewhere a long way away, we actually put them in the fields, allow them to integrate with the crops, so they're quite close. No vegetable crop is more than 20 meters away from a beetle bank. And that means that beetles and other predators can move. And we've done a range of, we actually measure how far beetles walk here. We do all sorts of strange things. And we know that beetles will travel 30 or 40 meters across ground. So where we are damaging the soil, which we do, every time we do any form of tillage, no matter how gentle, we are doing some damage. On the left, on the right there, you can see bare soil. This is something we avoid as much as possible. And where we have created bare soil and we get a crop in, we've got right next to, we've got a beetle bank, which has got a huge resource of beneficial insects that can move into that crop to control pests and disease problems. Within the green manures, we don't mow it all in one go. We leave strips unmown to flower. Flowering plants are the best way of encouraging insects. When I first started farming, I was really only interested in getting rid of every insect. I now realize that's completely the wrong approach. The more insects we have on our farm, the safer, more secure, and more resilient we feel, because the insect population really does control the pest population. So we have really no paranoia about insects, and for many, many years now, we've really had very few problems with any pest problems at all on the farm. Wildflowers, really important. We look after wildflowers in the same way we look after our crops. And flowering crops are really important. We allow certain crops, this is brassica, it's really important to allow these to flower. This is brassica that have overwintered. We've cut the cabbages, we've taken the crop away. We leave the stump of the plant in, it flowers in April and May, produces a fantastic resource in terms of biological activity, lots of pollinated insects. It also produces a lot of carbon, so lots of carbon material that can go back to the ground. And to me, a long time ago, this would have looked untidy. I would have hated this. I would have got rid of all this and composted it or ploughed it in. So, whereas now we can look at this and see this is a rich biological source, and this is where we generate our predators. This is how we never ever have any caterpillar problems on our cabbages. So weeds, we have a kind of a sympathetic approach to weeds, and we're quite happy to allow certain weeds at certain times of the year to move in. This is particularly important where we've got bare soil over winter and we haven't perhaps been able to get a green manure in on time. Sometimes it can be quite wet, and weeds will always come in and do that job. But weeds have a great relationship with the soil. They increase the biological diversity, they improve the pest predator balance, and they themselves also produce carbon, which goes back into the soil. Field boundaries. We have a policy of not mowing the last 2 meters against a hedge. We only mow it sort of once every 4 or 5 years, and we've managed to create a much wider diverse range of wildflowers growing there than we originally took on. And the idea is, again, it's all about increasing biodiversity. And then we move on to heavy carbon. Heavy carbon's the big stuff, the woody part. Now, if you farm, what you're actually doing, you're farming carbon. We fix carbon from the air, we put it back into the soil, we exploit that for our cropping, and that produces food, which we sell off, which we have to replace. So the real key point about soil management for us is really ensuring we can at least establish the same amount of carbon. We're not depleting carbon reserves, so we're maintaining carbon, but also ideally improving carbon. And most, not all, but most soils will benefit from higher rates of soil organic matter. So we're looking at doing this really through the work of what I call heavy carbon, which is trees. This guy, Stefan, he's actually from Canada. He came here and worked on our farm, must be nearly 20 years ago, and we just coppiced this hedge. This was a hedge I planted more than 33 years ago, and Stefan and I coppiced the hedge, and this was a regrowth just a few days after. And this is when I started to use carbon from the farm. So we suddenly realized that we had a potential carbon on the farm without really going off the farm. We could start using what we already had. Within our 17 acres, 18 acres, we have more than 2,000 meters of hedgerow. England's full of hedges, so we were able to use these hedges for carbon to go back onto the fields in the form of wood chip. Shelter belts also, this was one I planted a long time ago, it's now much taller, but shelter belts also are a really useful form of carbon because they need trimming occasionally. We can coppice those, and there's another source there of wood. And we're also bringing in, not huge amounts, but we're bringing some material from local sources, which comes from tree surgeons. This is chopped up trees, mostly from people's gardens. It's very local. It comes from mostly within just a 2 or 3 mile radius. And we're composting this. And this has been a really valuable farm input. It's normally considered to be a waste product, and they have to pay to take this material away, but we're quite happy to take it for nothing. It takes a while to compost. It takes about 12 months, but it's a really useful source of carbon. And the ramule chip wood, which is something we've really got into in the last 5 or 6 years, is taking fresh green wood, which we do in the winter. We're doing this from a piece of coppice we planted on wet land, and we're spreading this onto green manure crops and allowing the earthworms and the soil microbes and the bacteria to process this material in situ to release the nutrients. We've seen some quite dramatic changes in our soil since we've been using wood chip. And what we're looking at with the farm and the trials we're doing is how much of our farm would we need to put into trees in order to provide the entire carbon content of that farm. That would replace the material we're bringing in. And we've already got quite a bit on the farm. We're doing hedges, we've got coppice, and we've got agroforestry, which in a few years' time will start to produce wood as well. So quite apart from growing crops, growing biodiversity, we're also growing our carbon. And the idea really is that in some point in the not too distant future, the farm will be 100% self-sufficient in soil carbon. We won't have to think about bringing anything from anywhere else. And this is quite a game changer, because almost every farm I know has to bring something in from somewhere else. Even organic farms, mostly, particularly vegetable growing farms, are using ghost acres. These are acres that belong to somebody else for building fertility. And if you're importing manure onto your farm from a neighboring farmer, you're actually stealing that farm's fertility. And this is something which is really not practical and it's not terribly ethical. fertility really can and must come from the farm itself, and that's perfectly possible. This can be done, but it does need reorganization of agriculture. It needs a lot more trees, and it needs a lot more lateral thinking. This is the coppice. Top left is what I planted 20 years ago. Bottom right is how it looked 10 years ago. I mean, it's hugely productive. We're producing from this quite small area, it's only half an acre, it's 110 trees. We're producing around 30 cubic meters of wood chip, Ramure wood chip every year, which is enough to do well over an acre of land. And we don't apply it every year, we only apply it 2 years in 7. And we've seen some quite interesting changes in our soil, particularly in terms of the long-term carbon content, which has been going up quite significantly. Yeah, final slide. This was one of my neighbours took this. I think it's a beautiful picture. It's our veg shed showing the vegetables we grow. This was taken just a few days ago, actually, on one of the few sunny days we've had recently. Thank you. That's the end, I think. Yes, it is.
Okay, thank you so much. So we're ready to go on to the Q&A segment. We already have a few questions regarding the slides that Iain showed. I'm going to first have a couple questions myself for Iain and Liz. So we're going to get to that. And as I was saying earlier, for those who joined later, use the chat segment if you want to just share information or thoughts with people. And then if you want to ask a question, use the Q&A section and I'll relay them to the speakers. And if you're on Facebook, you need to come onto Zoom to be able to do that. All right. So my first question is for Iain. So you're not new to this movement. You're published, you're well-known. You've received a bunch of awards. You recently received the Soil Farmer of the Year award. So people know that you exist and they know that what you're doing works. And you were just speaking about carbon farming. And yet there is this persistent myth that the only way to do sustainable organic farming and the only way in particular to do carbon farming is to include animals. And often when we're speaking more about, carbon farming and these things, we're talking specifically about ruminants and so on. And we've even, when people knew that you were going to be our guest today, people emailed us to ask us those sorts of questions like, don't you need animals in a system? How can you, what sort of fertilizer can you use if you don't have animals? So I guess how is it that despite the fact that people like you have been present in the movement, and I know other farmers who've been present in the movement for a long time, who are well acknowledged, well established, well known, these myths still persist? Are you just not visible enough? Is it like a convenient belief system? Are these things valid in some places or not others? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a difficult one because maybe I'm not obvious enough to people, but I am quite vocal in what I do. We get a huge number of people coming here. I mean, we're counting in terms of thousands of people coming here every year to see what we're doing. Very few of those people go away and say, right, I'm going to change my farm tomorrow, because actually farming systems don't change very rapidly. People very much stay with what they know, because farming is an inherently unsecure way to get your living. And we have the saying, if it's not broke, don't fix it. And if they're kind of just about managing to work as it is, they're loath to try anything new, because there is a risk. There's a risk that when you change your system, there is a risk in that. And, if you do change your system, it needs to be done quite carefully. So I can sort of understand people's reticence. I'm a bit of a gambler. I suppose I stick my neck out and I'll have a go at something, and sometimes it fails and sometimes it works. This has worked. None of this has been done by design. All of my farm has really happened in a sort of organic way, if you like, for want of a better word. I didn't sit down 30 years ago. There wasn't a light bulb moment and say, right, that's it, we're going to change the farm and become vegan overnight. It wasn't like that. It was a gradual process. And I think this is how it probably would need to be. If people are going to convert their farms and reduce livestock, and we are seeing, reductions in livestock in the UK, it's starting to happen. And people are asking questions about, what am I going to do with my land now? I don't have animals. And I can answer most of those questions in a practical sense. So the movement has started. I think it's a long way to go. If the government was to turn around tomorrow and say, right, we're going to subsidize 10% of all livestock farmers to get rid of their livestock and support a more humane, ethical system, they'd be falling over themselves to do it, because they get money to do it. So it is really about the politics of agriculture, I think, and not just the practicalities. It is a difficult thing to make a living at, and the politicians that we have to deal with are not generally supportive of these sorts of big changes. We know it works. We know this can be scaled up to any scale. There's no limit to how big a farm you could have, similar to mine. It would be lots of small units. It wouldn't be a 10,000 acre field, but you could do it on 10,000 acres. And it doesn't have to be top quality land either. I mean, we're producing vegetables on land which would normally not be producing vegetables.
Liz, I actually had a question that's a little bit in the same direction, I guess. Your experience has not so far been as much as an established farmer, but you've been very active. Well, you've been involved in circles that are pro-sustainable farming, pro-food justice. And I guess your vision when you start your own farm perhaps would be a Caribbean version of Iain's farm. I don't know, but I guess, the vision that we all share is kind of the same, right? That we want this like sustainable, stock-free system. And we know it works. We've seen that people are doing it. And obviously you're aware of the reasons to transition from all these different perspectives. So could you speak a little bit about your experiences as a vegan in circles that are talking about sustainable farming and agroecology and these things? And do you see any impediments towards working towards this vision from your experiences?
The vision of veganic agriculture?
Right, exactly. Like, if we're sitting here together and we want to move towards stock-free agroecology, yeah.
So when I was on the farm at UC Santa Cruz, and also generally just being in the food justice world in the United States, which is obviously very anti-CAFOs, factory farming, and also very anti-industrial agriculture. It's also, of course, pro-regenerative, as you know. And I think the biggest thing I can say as a vegan is that because of regenerative agriculture, which promotes basically, as you said, as you had in your other talk previously 2 weeks ago, that the cow is the quote unquote savior of now how to regenerate the earth. It's not just about, they don't just only talk about cows, they talk about sustainability and a counter to the green revolution as now eating local, which is not a bad thing, but that also includes where you get your protein. The argument is that why should we get beans from Ohio to California when you can just kill a chicken? So we get that narrative. And I think what's missing, obviously, is the ethics that goes into, and you and I talk about this, what would a food system look like when we actually include sentient beings in our moral framework? What does this look like? It doesn't mean that we have the answer right now. Many of us are working towards Black liberation, towards food justice, towards access to healthy foods, towards women's rights, gender equality, but we're not there yet. So, but for some reason in this community, there's always the knee-jerk reaction to look at vegans and the way we see how we think that there is even a more compassionate way to look at food justice as somehow, well, let's evoke the environment, let's evoke all the transportation costs, let's evoke all kinds of things. So I think what's missing in the discussion is how do we incorporate other sentient beings, the cows and the pigeons and the pigs and the chickens into our system. Another thing, so because of that, because of not really looking at that, you then get people in the food justice movement who will now connect a sense of spirituality to killing a pig. So on the farm, I was, not in a discussion, but listening to two young people talking about being on a farm and the ritual of killing a pig as some connection to spirituality. And of course, the answer to that is, I'm sure the pig doesn't want to be involved in that. But it's this whole idea that humans are the center of the universe. And when we are looking at issues that affect other humans, we by default tend to leave out other sentient beings. So there's a lot of pushback with that. But I mean, I think what underlines it is the same thing that underlines a lot of people who tend to push back against eating a plant-based food, or just living a vegan lifestyle, and and not dealing with the issue of the ethics of it. So I get that. And, we get into these circular arguments about everything. Another thing, of course, is, well, in agriculture, when I was on the farm, we had a big problem with gophers, because of course, if you have food, you're going to create, if you're farming it in this way, the way that they did it, which was not veganic farming, which was not looking for ways in which you could minimize the pain and suffering of the animals that come over and say, hey, I want some food, and the population increase that happens. So again, people fall on this, well, what if you're starving and you're on an island kind of narrative? But we don't do that when we're looking at feminist issues, when we're looking at violence against women. We don't tolerate it. We don't tolerate patriarchy. We don't tolerate a capitalist system that exploits people, but we still live in it. So I think it's important to note that.
Yeah, I feel like at some point we'll have to do a webinar that's kind of focused on these things. I guess that's not going too deeply into that, wouldn't be the topic for today, but the pig, the ritual slaughter of a pig is something that comes up so often. I had a roommate who had been vegan, and the way he marked his further enlightenment of, no, it's better to eat local and agroecology and so on, as if those things were mutually exclusive, was that he raised a pig with his previous roommates and then slaughtered the pig. And that was sort of their way of spiritually transitioning to going away from it. So at some point we'll have to get more into this, perhaps in another webinar. So we have some questions here. A few of the questions are more technical for Iain, and then another question is more around like policy and movements. So I think I'm going to, maybe Iain, I'm going to regroup a few of the technical questions in one, and you might want to address a few of those together. So one of them is, any trends noticed re green manure and earthworms yet? Do they fare better without animal manure? Eric is asking, why 2 years of nitrogen fixing crops? Isn't just a few months sufficient to then grow a cash crop afterward? I don't want to maybe ask you too many. Somebody, I didn't notice this. Somebody noticed, was that a cow in the field next to Stefan? So I guess that's a question too. So maybe if you can address those for now.
Okay, I'll deal with the cow one first because I actually put that in deliberately because I thought it's never ever encouraged anybody to ask it before, but it has now, so I'm quite pleased to come up. The picture was taken about 20 years ago. It's my neighbour's cow. I have a neighbour. That cow no longer exists actually, but my neighbour is an organic farmer. He has beef. He has about 50 beef cows on 350 acres. So the idea that he produces, about 50 animals on 350 acres, which is not a viable living by any standard. He has to work outside the farm. It's a part-time farm. We're producing and feeding. In fact, we employ 8 people on our farm on 18 acres. And I think the illustration there is how much more we can produce on that land and keep people in jobs. As opposed to the cow. It was a lovely cow. It's a Jersey cow. It never actually ever got milked. It just hung around with another one, and it never actually went anywhere much. You have a question about the green manure. Why have such a long green manure? In fact, it's slightly more than 2 years. It's 2.5 years, and the reason really is that we've been cropping this land now for 33 years continually, and we've only been able to do that because we've maintained fertility and we've maintained organic matter. And the 2-year or longer green manure is essential because it gives a breathing space to the land. It allows the earthworm population to increase. It allows us to build lots of fertility, put lots of carbon back. A very short green manure won't do that. In fact, a very short green manure could actually have the opposite effect and actually lose carbon. It could stimulate the loss of carbon. So the long-term green manure is really important in terms of fertility building. And we have this 2-year period within 7, which we think is really important. And then going on to the green manure, earthworms versus animal manures. Well, we haven't used animal manures for 33 years, so I don't really know. But looking at other people's fields, we have far more earthworms than anybody else. And in fact, we've recently done a survey with our earthworms that has drawn some comparisons with land which is in long-term grass, where there are animals. We have nearly 4 times the earthworm population compared with that farm that has had grass, which has been down for, we think, more than 100 years. So green manures are really good at feeding earthworms. It's really about feeding the earthworm, which is so important to the health of our soil.
I'm going to quickly do one more technical question well, actually, 2 more quick questions for Iain, and then we're going to move on to questions that are more about kind of large-scale transitions. So hi, Iain. We have been growing veganically on our 2-acre vegetable farm for almost 10 years, but struggle with low phosphorus. Can ramial wood chips contain phosphorus, or is there another on-farm source to consider? So I'll go ahead with that question first.
Right, okay, yeah, really interesting. Yesterday, we published a report, the Organic Research Centre published a report looking at our trials into ramial wood chip over the last 4 years. And the really interesting point that came up, not just on our farm, but the other 2 farms that were involved, was the input of phosphate from ramial wood chip. It was really quite significant. Phosphate is linked very closely to biological activity in the soil. You may have plenty of phosphate, but it may not be available. And it's really about the availability. Nearly all soils in the world have phosphate reserves. The problem is really lack of availability, and it's usually down to lack of the correct soil fauna. Ramial wood chip, although it does contain some phosphate, is relatively small amount. The way it works is really to wake up the biological activity of soil and allow the microbes and the fungi to process the soil phosphate and make it available to plants. So ramial wood chip is really good for phosphate release.
So here I'm going to read 2 questions in one. The first one is obviously for Iain. In terms of the second one, if Liz also wants to say something, that's fine. So the first one is there any trend in the UK to shift government subsidies from animal ag to from animal agriculture to plant-based agriculture? Considering the status of our planet, there should be, not? And then, so that's one question. And then another question, someone is asking, what are some climate smart, climate friendly crops that former livestock farmers could transition to?
Right, okay. Yes, there is beginning to be a sort of a slight move towards animal reduction on farms by government policy. We're just coming out of the EU, and actually, despite the fact that I think this is quite a bad move in general, there are one or two good things that coming out of the EU. We've completely had to change our agricultural support system, and that support system is just been announced literally this week. There's going to be a huge change towards tree planting, which inevitably will be a reduction of livestock, because a lot of the land which trees are planted on presently is livestock. So that's already started. So the government will be indirectly, there's no direct policy that says we're going to, stop supporting livestock, but indirectly there will be a move towards reduced livestock. And because the way the farm support system is now changing, which is all about supporting public goods, we're no longer going to be supporting farmers for production. Farmers will no longer be paid for what they produce. Farmers will be paid for what they produce in terms of public goods. Public goods are things like clean air, clean water, good environment, biodiversity, maintenance of insects, maintenance of flora and fauna. And all these things actually do depend on the reduction of livestock in order to make them work. So in an indirect way, this is starting to happen. The other thing that's happening also is that livestock are so bad in terms of making a viable income that, so many farmers, without the support mechanism, they will have to give up livestock. They won't be able to continue with it, but they will be paid to plant trees and look after the environment. And rewilding, we are now talking quite seriously in terms of the possibility of rewilding, and that will be grant aided too. So I'm fairly positive that perhaps in my lifetime, I hope, if I live long enough, we will see some real changes on this. The other question was to do with a crop for post livestock farms. Is that how I understood it?
Yeah, it was, what are some climate smart or climate friendly crops that former livestock farmers could transition to? I assume that depends also like where they live.
Yeah. We're a bit limited in the UK because our climate is such rubbish. There are a few pulses, a few beans, and that's the area that will be concentrated on. So, and that has started. Pulse crops are an obvious one to replace livestock. A lot of livestock is on land which is not suitable for production of anything other than trees. And this is where a lot of the trees are going to go. The trees are going to go on some of the poorest land. So that kind of mops up quite a large area. As livestock numbers drop, and they will, and they are dropping, then land becomes available, because livestock take up more than just the land they graze. They take up a huge area of land elsewhere, either in our country or more often in some southern part of the world, and that releases land also. So there's big opportunities for farmers to start thinking in terms of growing crops for more direct human consumption, which presently are being imported. This is also something which the government are quite keen to support as well.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point, that what you were saying about how a lot of the land isn't necessarily suitable for anything other than trees, but I think that that's something that gets lost a lot, that we don't think about. What we often hear livestock farmers say, and people who are in favor of the ideas of like grazing is going to help the planet and so on, is they say that they're grazing animals on land that wouldn't be suitable to grow food, so why not do that? But of course it's better to have forests. And I remember reading an article by a British livestock farmer, and she was basically creating this dichotomy between growing, producing beef locally or importing soy from Brazil. And I thought that doesn't seem to make sense, because I assume that you can grow, other legumes in the UK. It doesn't have to be that you're importing Brazilian soy necessarily. And then I looked into it, and it turns out that I think in England, people grow quite a lot of fava beans, and a lot of it is exported to Egypt. And so, so obviously other stuff does grow. It's not like you have to import Brazilian soybeans if you're not, yeah.
Brazilian soybeans are a fraction of the price of the fava beans. That's why we don't use more of our own protein.
All right.
And I think that speaks to what I was talking about, where farmers are growing broke because you have free trade agreements, you have a system in which cheap food can be exported and imported, and there's no or lack of support for small farmers, lack of laws that protect small farmers. So they go out of business. In the United States, they sell their land, go out of business. But if you are living in, let's say, Malawi, Africa, it's not like you can sell your land and then move to the city. Some people do. If that's all you have, because you can't even afford to get work in the city, you stay there. And people farm for cultural reasons. It's part of who they are. So it's you know, there are all these variables to consider.
Yeah, I think it's also about clarifying what is a political issue and what is a technical or, you know, agronomical or ecological issue. In the case of the article that I was reading, basically the person was implying that in the UK, if you're not producing beef, then you're just not really doing anything with the land, then you have to import, whereas people are importing for other reasons. It's not because they can't produce food, it's because of, you know, free trade agreements and all this stuff. So I think that confusion around, like, there's sort of a mixing of these different issues that's allowing a certain narrative that, you know, that we wouldn't be able to produce certain plant foods locally when in fact we can.
Yeah, can I just say something? So Eric Oltermanis from Food First, and he's no longer with there anymore, wrote a book called Foodies Guide to Capitalism. And he's been in the food world for a number of years. And he said the one thing that he noticed is that people in the food movement, unless you are a farmer and you're directly affected by what's going on, they don't really understand the politics behind the food system. So people see things like free trade, or they go to Whole Foods, or you go to, here we have Publix in South Florida, where you have the label, some, I don't know, green something that says your food is organic. And we tend to think, oh, okay, this must be good. Obviously, organic food is good for us. But I think what's missing is an understanding of actually what this green revolution actually meant and its purpose. And I can talk a little bit more about the politics behind that if you want, and what it's doing now. Because unless we understand that, organization, you know, Bayer, Dow, DuPont, and all these organizations and all these large, you know, Walmart, are going to just adapt and basically grab these things like organic and regenerative and agroecology, and say, look, you know, we're part of the solution now. And I think that's the big thing that's missing from, you know, the whole conversation. In addition to the idea that we also need to look at a system that includes other sentient animals into our discussion.
Yeah, that's a really good point Liz has made. And I'd like to add to this, you know, we've seen a huge rise in the vegan movement in the UK. I don't know how it is in your part of the world, but here it's been really significant. And what's happened is you've got a whole lot of big multinational corporation companies who jumped on the bandwagon and now producing a vast range of vegan foods, most of which are complete and total rubbish, even the organic ones. You know, it's a lot of it's highly processed food. So big corporations will always jump on the bandwagon. And even, you know, where we've got organic farming, who farmers generally don't use a huge amount of products, but they're being continually bombarded with biotechnology and biological materials to use on their farm because everybody wants to sell something to somebody else. And this is what we're up against. And that, you know, for most farmers, we don't need all this stuff. We can manage quite well without it. We've got natural systems of dealing with this. We don't need all this propping up with our farm. We shouldn't do if we're doing it properly.
Yeah. Here, for example, I'm growing some food in, I live in an apartment with some sunlight and I'm growing some food. So if I want to do that, what's the knee-jerk reaction? You go to Home Depot or you go to Walmart and you get soil and you get perlite, which is these little things that you put in the soil in the pot, and you get a number of things. So you have a pot that's not being grown on the ground, so it needs a little more nutrients. So what you do, you go by and you see, oh, organic fertilizers. So there are actually, I think Down to Earth is a good company that sells plant-based stuff, but you can also get stuff on your own. Like right here, we have coconut. Coconut has these strips in the core, and I can use that instead of perlite. I have neighbors who have soil. Hey, can I borrow some of your soil? But there's also this, oh my gosh, I can't go get some soil because maybe it's contaminated. At the same time, we eat contaminated food, but we're worrying about where we're getting our soil. So I think there's a number of things that, the whole way of looking at this needs to be changed or shifted.
It's already been almost an hour and a half, but we do have a few more questions that I think are very interesting. Would you both be okay with still doing a couple questions?
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
Okay. Okay, so this is a question for Liz, but I think that, Iain might also want to add to this. The corporations and banks driving the green revolution in India and Africa are largely headquartered in the West. What political goals should movements in the US and UK have to support groups like La Via Campesina? In other words, what policies should political movements in the West be seeking?
Okay, well, that's obviously a huge question. And number one, I would say that, we have to acknowledge that small farmers are struggling in the US, I'm sure probably in Europe as well. So it's not just people in other parts, in the global South. La Via Campesina actually has members who are in the US. And you have to deal with issues like, for example, in the US, Black farmers can't get certain loans. What I find that most farmers are talking about, regardless of where you are policy. What kinds of policies are we looking at? I think we need to divest in policies that support, subsidies to large farms. We need to look at the seed laws to really understand and support groups are fighting for seed sovereignty. In many, you buy seed and it's owned by someone else. I mean, when the heck did that happen? Seed was something that was just part of the land. You have companies like Pepsi-Cola, Nestle, who are competing for our water supply and creating laws, even state laws and city laws in favor of that. So I think the main thing I want to say is that we need to look to these farmers who are creating these social movements like La Via Campesina and other organizations. Of course, La Via Campesina is a good start because they're like 300 million people. And look to see what kinds of policies they're actually working on in that specific part of the world and support them. You can support them financially, you can support them in other ways. So again, that's a huge question, but let's look, every place is a little bit different. And we have to look at these movements and look to the farmers themselves who are working on these things and the NGOs who are supporting them to now, move ahead and support them either financially, either volunteering, looking at policies and working towards voting to change that, as well as a number of things that they're doing.
Yeah, could I add to that? I think in terms of support, we also need support from people who are buying food, for want of a better word, our consumers. And One thing that has changed since COVID is suddenly, I don't know whether this is universal across the whole world, but certainly in the UK, people are suddenly relating to their local food producers in a way they never have before. You know, this COVID situation has woken something up in not everybody, but a lot of people who want something which is local, which is something they can trust, something which they know where it's coming from and how it's produced. People suddenly got interested in food. People are no longer eating out because all the restaurants and everything's shut. They're going home, they're buying veg from our shop, they're going home, they're cooking, they're sitting down with their families and they're talking about food. This hasn't happened in this country for several generations. So I think we need to try and engage, you know, the public in this process of decorporating food and making it something which they are a part of as well. Because at the moment, most people do not feel as if they're part of any food production system at all.
Yeah, I was born and raised in the Caribbean, and you know, in Trinidad and several parts of the Caribbean, the government is now promoting growing your own food and eating more local food because imports are now being compromised. So this is actually, you know, a good way to capitalize on that. Unfortunately, I will go back to saying that, you know, because people don't understand the system, when COVID goes away, everybody goes back to normal because it's basically more convenient. You know, simple things like people don't even understand why grocery stores actually will tell food suppliers that your banana needs to be a specific size and a specific curvature and a specific color, or your tomato needs to be the same thing. You know, it's about marketing, and we don't really understand what's going on behind the scenes. Now you have CSAs in which is great. I would suggest if you have, look in your community to see if you have community supported agricultural systems, which is basically a good way to support small farmers in your area. But now it's co-opted by Amazon and Walmart. You know, I see my neighbors now getting all this food dropped off, and it's happened before COVID, on their doorstep. That's a CSA in, you know, a corporatized CSA. Why not support the CSA in your local area if you have that and if that's possible?
Yeah, I like that, Liz, that you pointed out that it's, you know, for example, Via Campesina is not just the Global South, it's also the Global North. And the whole thing of all of those farmers and all of those organizations coming together was that they realized that they had common experiences and common cause throughout the world. And it wasn't just a Global North versus Global South thing, but that farmers in the Global North, of course, they had often a better standard of living, or, you know, but nonetheless, they were facing the exact same issues as farmers in the Global South. And so they have common cause, and fighting to help, or fighting against the things that are destroying small-scale farming in the Global North really is the same thing as fighting against those same things in the Global South. So, like, for example, in the United States, there's the U.S. Food Sovereignty Alliance. So that might be something to look into for people who are in the U.S. I know that in Europe, there are plenty of organizations that are members of Via Campesina. And so, for example, free trade agreements are one area where all of these people from around the world came together because they were saying it's not Global South versus Global North, but rather it's the small scale ecological farmers everywhere that are getting, you know, pushed out by the big corporations. And yeah, and so whether you're in Norway or the US or, like, you know, Mali or Mexico, ultimately you're facing these same challenges. There was, yeah, go ahead.
I also wanted to note is that I think, you know, the Green Revolution also sort of set the stage for free trade agreements to some degree, because it wasn't never just about food. It was about, I would say, US arrogance of looking for ways to feed the world. But there's a reason why historians say it's actually called the Green Revolution, This started in the 1960s, even though it started with Norman Borlaug, who was looking for technological ways to change the structure of wheat in order for it to be resilient against pests. It was basically adopted from a political standpoint and named the Green Revolution because the government basically thought, being anti-communist and anti-socialist, particularly at that time, you have the Vietnam War, you have this sort of Cold War going on with Russia, you have now Cuba. The idea was that social movements, riots and uprise and revolutions start when people don't have food to eat. And what happened was that they were afraid that poverty would now cause these uprising, opening the door for communism and socialism. So the Green Revolution was actually accounted to the name the Red Revolution, which was actually about these social movements uprising because of poor standards of living. And then, of course, you have another political component that I mentioned, which is where you have these large corporations basically going towards governments and foundations supporting it, like the Bill and Linda Gates Foundation that has what's called the Alliance for Green Revolution, which they call Green Revolution #2, because they went to India, they went to Southeast Asia. Now Africa is, within the past 10 years or so, the new frontier for these companies to now sell their products, because as we know, that's what corporations do. It's about profit. It's about accumulation of capital. So now they go in there and they make these deals with these governments. Okay, the Green Revolution is going to now fight hunger. It's going to build your economy. And these governments pour tons of money, like Malawi. You can actually research that whole story. These governments are buying products, which is basically chemical fertilizers and inputs and tractors and so on. Not so much tractors, and of course, an area where you're poor and you have 1 or 2 acres of land, to now push the Green Revolution. And obviously, in the past few years, poverty still exists. So it never really dealt with the situation it was supposed to deal with. And I think that's also important to note, that the Green Revolution is a political movement.
All right, so we have a question that's very related to this one, and I think, maybe you think that you've already said what you wanted to say about that. I'll just quickly answer. So Tim, you asked about books and newsletters and organizations regarding system structure, Green Revolution, Agroecology movement. So if you scroll up, you'll see that the resources that Liz had in her presentation, she copy pasted them. So there you can just scroll up and you'll find those resources. And then also, if you go onto our website, veganic.world, you'll find some resources specifically about the veganic component of that. But we could also, after this, do a bit of we could write a post just putting together a bunch of resources that people have mentioned and put that out to people who attended this. All right. So so this question, I think we've already started talking about it. So for those who don't know, that's a book that Iain Tolhurst wrote, Growing Green.
Co-wrote, Jenny Hall and myself.
Co-wrote. All right. So, question to both of you, and I think that both of you have already started, you're already, in the process of answering this through your work. How do we move from the Green Revolution to widespread agroecology?
Liz,
okay.
are you gonna go first on this one?
Yeah,
So
how
that's
do
a big
we, yeah, how
question.
do we change a political system?
Yeah, that's well, it's
That's a broad question.
how long
broad
have we got to answer this one?
I'll say this, the underlying thread between this is capitalism. The bad word that nobody wants to talk about, the sort of default system that we live in, that we actually don't even critique in our schools in the financial, in finance. And what do I mean by capitalism? I'm not saying that you can't sell your crops to make a living. I'm saying that capitalism, corporations, big business particularly, is about the accumulation of capital, the accumulation of wealth. And the whole idea about that is you keep building wealth and building wealth and building wealth. And to build wealth, you need to look at human labor, animal labor, the soil, as all these commodities that you have to extract as much as you can from them at the cheapest rate possible. So in spite of the fact that we live in that system and it's a huge Goliath that would take a massive revolution to change, I don't know what the alternative is to that at all. But my point is that in spite of the fact that we have to look at that, there are certain small things that we can do to support the system. I think one of the biggest things people don't do is that the first knee-jerk reaction is, okay, what do I need to do? Instead of actually trying to understand what the system is. Because I can say things like, for example, in the US, you know, you have every few years, you have the food, what do you call it again? I can't remember, you know, the food budget. I can't hear you. The Farm Bill. Yeah.
Farm Bill, yeah.
Right. You have the Farm Bill. And in the Farm Bill, there's a number of rules and regulations and laws that mostly support big business. Well, the Farm Bill is actually 900 pages long. So in order for me to understand the Farm Bill, I have to look to organizations who I trust, who are understanding it, and they will tell me what kinds of policies to support and what policies not to support. So my point is that this is a huge thing, and it is important before we even look for answers, we need to know what the problem is, because all too often everybody wants to say, okay, I get it, in 10 minutes of you know, your talk or whatever, you know, what is the answer? So again, I go back to looking at you know, MSD, which is Landless Workers in Brazil, La Via Campesina. You have organizations here in the US and in Europe in which you have farmer coalitions, and every group is different and every group has its specific issues. In the US, again, you have laws that are discriminatory based on race. So support these organizations here in the US and support the organizations who have lawyers who are working on policy change, because again, the biggest thing is policy change. Going back to what agroecology is, specifically the issues of regenerative agriculture, we can look at the principles of agroecology and implement that from a more technical standpoint, learn what that is. Iain, of course, did a great talk on some of the principles. There are other principles that you can look at. It all depends on where you are on the planet. Not everything works. So we want to support farmers who are actually organic. We want to support small farmers. The biggest thing is to look to support your small farmers in a system in which, you know, we can't, without a revolution, we're not going to change capitalism as the way it is now, unless, you know, people are starving. So I think it's important to understand that if you're growing food, something simple like, I really believe in this, is to start growing something. Because I have found that people who are more likely to start growing food, whether if it's you're trying some time in your, you know, in your house, like one plant, it's sort of like a door that you can open where you actually learn how to how this entity grows, and use that to now learn about that crop, learn about it from a political standpoint, learn about it from an agroecological standpoint, and use that to tap into understanding the food system. Because I truly feel that people who tend to grow their own food tend to be more open to looking at, you know, within all the media bombardment of information you have, if your mind is already set on thinking about this, you're going to start looking at the things that draw in those things that are important to you and important to the food system. If you're not, and you listen to a talk and you're like, oh, I'm into green living, I'm into all of that stuff, you're going to miss certain things because you're not in that world. And I know when I lived on a farm and I started to grow on my food and I started to over time learning about it, now I'm queuing into things that people aren't queuing into. So I think that process is more important than just looking for these knee-jerk reactions that, which is fine. I understand that everybody wants to, but we have to start looking at processes first and understanding that. Does that make sense?
I'm going to ask Iain if you want to say anything about the same question, and also something that came to mind. I don't know if you find this relevant or not, but in North America, something that's come up pretty often is that in terms of veganic growing, there's really not a lot of education, and there's not a lot of like opportunities for farmers to come together and work with each other. We've created a few of those opportunities, but haven't been able to do so much. But I know that in the agroecology world, that's a very important thing, is the farmer to farmer education. And that's something that I think that you've done quite a bit. Like, not only you train people on your farm, but you also travel to other countries to help other farmers get started. So I'm wondering if that is, something that you might want to, if that's part, an important part of the equation that we should be thinking about or supporting.
Okay, yes, it is a very important part of the whole equation. Just going back to where Liz was, I agree 100% with what Liz was saying. She emphasized the point there about support, and yes, support is a really valuable thing. As a farmer, we need support from our food buyers, from our consumers, and this is really important. We have the second cheapest food culture in the world in UK, even cheaper than US, believe it or not. Food in this country is ridiculously cheap. And I've done quite a lot of studies into where food prices are today as to where they were 40 years ago when I started, and the story is quite depressing, actually. One thing which has to change, and it's not just in the UK but across the world, in many developed countries, we have to change the culture of food. The culture of food has been taken over by capitalism, basically. It's become a commodity. I mean, I'm sure Liz could tell you more about this. We need to change that culture. We need to get back to having more direct support from consumers. We need to get back to the point where people value food enough that they're prepared to pay a decent price in order to get a decent product without trashing the planet, because they're paying for it in other ways. They're paying for it through their taxes, they're paying for it through their health. Our National Health Service is groaning under the weight of disease, nearly all of which is related in some way to food. I mean, the present pandemic is related to the production of food somewhere in the world. So, we need to look closely at that. And if we're going to chip away at this horrendous capital system, which none of us really like that much, and we know it's not going to change overnight because, we're not going to have that sort of revolution, but we can chip away at it by encouraging people to support us. For every pound that people spend on our farm, 90% of that goes back into local economy. We can chip away at these large multinational corporations in that way by reducing their customer base and putting it more in the hands of local people. And I think that's something which is achievable on a local level. So I think we have to think local about this. It is a global issue, but we have to think local. On the subject of education, in terms of trying to promote what we do, yes, I often feel quite frustrated sometimes that I'm not able to do more, because I have a farm to run, and actually my passion is the farm. I don't want to be away all the time. We do have a program of trying to, or we do in fact, achieve some level of education to people that come here. We have a 3-month training program. Some of these people have gone away and are sort of continuing with what we do. And we really like the idea of that. And we really need to get down to sort of barefoot agronomy where people can teach other people. Again, this is something which really needs support. You know, this costs money and time to do this, and we need support. Again, it's down to political will. You know, if we had the political will, we could do a lot more. And I think this is really a job for those in power to really start to think about. You know, we have one of the lowest farm populations in the world in UK. We have almost nobody working on farms anymore. This is a serious problem. And we know that in the future, we need a lot more people back on farms. But we have to make farms workable, it has to be viable, they have to be accessible, and they have to be places that people can and want to live. So that means housing, you know, access to land. There's a lot of issues there which could be very easily supported by government policy. And I think that's where we need to really concentrate. Okay, I can set an example, I can show people what the value and the possibilities are for the future, but really it needs people to go out there and do it. And I think, you know, we need to set up an educational program, and we do need support for that.
The other thing I want to add is, you know, people always say, well, you know, if we have higher prices from farmers, you know, we're you know, how is the poor going to be fed? That's the big argument that we see. And what's interesting is that when I was on a farm and we had a number of farm workers in California talk to us about the horrible conditions, like, for example, not having enough water stations in the hot California sun. Many of them said, we just wish people would not want to buy cheap food. And I was looking at some statistics that actually showed the rate of increase in the profits of big ag, the chemical corporations, the supermarkets, and the McDonald's, and, you know, these large food companies that where you have to buy, you know, where they either provide inputs at high cost, of course, that keeps going up, or they actually buy from the farmers themselves. They have found that that rate is much higher than the rate of increase in what farmers get for their food. So somebody is pocketing that increase in money. So it's not the farmers that actually, if that money can go to the farmers, farmers would be able to make, you know, a better living. And we must understand that these corporations keep making more money and making more money and making a killing. It's not the fact that the price of food is cheap. Oh, how are we going to how are the poor people going to pay for all of this stuff? It's that corporations are actually taking that money and pocketing that money. So we have to shift the focus. Why are corporations taking all that money that can actually go to small farmers?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And also, of course, you know, having systems for the poor is important that the government can support. But that's another issue. This is directly with the price of food from farmers.
Yeah, I mean, when you mentioned the CSAs earlier, so community, I know that not everyone's in the US. I don't know if it's the same word elsewhere, but community supported agriculture is when you sign up for like a box, often of vegetables or something like that, and you have a subscription and it's a local farm, and then you get a bag from them every week or something like that. So that's a CSA, and Liz was talking about that earlier. And a couple years ago in the Bay Area where we're located, there was a small veganic farm that was doing a CSA, and they went out of business. They had to, the people doing it had to quit farming, get corporate jobs, and they, you know, we lost our local veganic farm. And I think that's a shame. I think that in the animal rights community recently, there's been an increased interest in stories of like, let's get livestock farmers to transition to, you know, plant-based farming, which is great. But you know, there are already people doing organic farming and they're not getting support. And then it's not only about people who are farming livestock. I mean, anybody else should ideally transition to a vegan agroecological system. And so, so I think that there's sort of, it's kind of sexier to think about the person who's stopping to farm their cows and transitioning than it is to support the people already doing that work. But I think that we also need to support the people also already doing that work, both as consumers, like actually buying from them and signing up for CSAs when we can. And on Veganic World, if you're in North America, we have a map of veganic farms. And in Europe, there is also a map. There's also a map of veganic farms in Europe, but I don't remember the URL. We can put that later. But also it's a question of, you know, as Liz was saying, of policy, because ultimately small farmers are being harmed everywhere, whether they're, you know, small farmers with chickens or without, like they're all being harmed by the same policies. And so I think that focusing on helping that and kind of joining cause with them is really important. There have been quite a few questions for Iain around things like wood chips and what trees you grow, but it's already like getting late. So what I would suggest is that if this is okay with everyone, that we could stop the webinar here. And then in terms of the more technical questions that we didn't have time to answer, people can buy Iain's book, Growing Green, that Liz is holding up. They can also go on his website, tolhurstorganic.co.uk, I believe. And you know, maybe email, or if you go on the website, there's a lot of information. And yeah, I think we can start wrapping it up. Is that okay with everyone?
Yeah.
Yes.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll just mention in terms of Seed the Commons, first of all, thank you so much to both of you for being here. That was very interesting. I'm really happy with this panel. We will send out the websites, the resources, we'll send that out. If you find this webinar useful or other webinars that we've done and you want to support the series, we have a donation page, so you can donate there. Also, Seed the Commons is a 501c3 and Giving Tuesday is coming up, so keep us in mind. And I'll also mention that next week, my dog is crying outside the window. I'll also mention that next week on November 27th, we're doing a special webinar. It's not going to be the usual format. We're not going to be live streaming on Facebook. It will only be a Zoom event, and it will be more informal. November 27th is Native American Heritage Day. And so there's going to be like a fireside chat with Chema Hernandez-Gil, who's the other founder of Seed the Commons. And so if you want to sign up for that event, we'll also post there. So the registration link, if you go to the chat section, that's the registration link for next week's events, November 27. All right. So thank you both so much for joining us today.